Challengestone. We are in the finals now. Of course, it
Yep.
is going to be Trump going up against Kibler, kind of
Did you
as
almost just drop
predicted.
life coach?
Yeah.
You were
Uh,
saying life coach there, weren't you?
I
Very
almost did.
disappointed.
I had the wrong page of my notebook open from the last
Okay.
match we just did.
Mm.
I was like, wait a minute, he just
Yep.
lost.
Yep.
But yeah, I
Yep.
mean, this is a sick finals. These guys really know what they're doing as far as odds and evens challenge stone goes. It's
Yep.
pretty awesome, and I think that one of the more interesting things now that we've really seen their decks and how they've done is to maybe jump back, take a look at the interviews of these guys and just kind of like remember what were these guys thinking when they made their decks and how did that play out, because we just got to see them get to the finals and now they get to change a couple cards. So I think
Yep.
that's a good place for us to go to.
I think it is a good place for us to go to, and for the people maybe just starting to watch, the format was we gave these players the odds and even challenge all at the same time. They built the decks all at the same time, three different classes, abide by the rules, 20 minutes. And then immediately after this is when we interviewed each player individually. So, we're going to get their thoughts on their deck building originally, and we'll get to see, some reference to how that turned out because they are again in the finals. And immediately after we go through each of the players' interviews, we're going to see what cards ended up changing. So maybe we can see some of the little fixes, a few things they weren't happy with, or maybe some matchup changes. There's a lot of strategy, a little bit of deck building left to be had on the tournament. So let's get it underway, and let's hear from Kibler. Kibler, man, you got some good decks here. What'd you think of the challenge? How did you come to the classes, and what do you think is going to be good here?
So the two things that I was thinking about when I was going through building my decks was trying to identify the classes where you get to still play with some of their best stuff. Like
Yeah,
for instance, when you're playing even cost spells, it's like you still get to play Innervate and Wild Growth, which is one of the things that immediately drew me to
yeah,
Druid. And the other thing was what isn't there. So what are the cards that people can't play with? And one of the big cards people can't play with is Big Game Hunter. Because
yeah.
Big Game Hunter is an even power minion. I was like, okay, well, I can play a bunch of 7 power minions in my decks. I can play, Volcanic Lumberers in my Druid deck, and whatever, like I just Prophet Veil in my Priest deck, and things like that. That in normal circumstances I just really wouldn't consider.
And silence doesn't work either, so you
But that
kind of get
was
the safety on
Yeah,
on the
it's one of the
ancients.
my Druid deck is full of Ancient of Wars. It's like there's no Spellbreakers, there's no Owls. So like I'm even playing Bolvar in my Paladin deck because there's no Big Game Hunter or Silence to take him out.
Yep,
So
yep.
and then there's little things like the fact that I sort of assumed that one of the really popular minions would be Sludge Belcher because
Hmm.
Sludge Belcher is a pretty obvious high power minion that with odd attack. And then I was like, okay, well in my priest deck I'm just playing multiple copies of Shadow Madness because
Recombobed that guy, right?
exactly. I have Shrinkmeister and Recombobulator and sort of the stuff to go with supporting Shadow Madness
Yeah,
because it's like, okay, well even just naturally I feel like Sludge Belcher is likely to be these things are going to be good against Sludge Belcher, so I'm going to try and line them up there.
yeah. I think you certainly have some very refined decks. But I'm kind of curious. It's like not only what you build, it's what you expect other people to build, right? And I see
Mhm.
that you have Harrison Jones in every single deck, so you're expecting people to play weapon decks, I guess.
I like well the thing is like because weapons were unrestricted by the sort of rules, it's like okay, well you can play like a card like Death Spite is like really powerful in a format where people are playing lots of stuff like like Sludge Belchers or like there's gonna be lots of 3/3s because you can only really play 3/3s for three. That's why my priest deck just has both 3/4s it can play at 3 mana.
Yeah,
So it's like, okay, I think that it's reasonable that people will play, warrior decks that have axe and death spite, and it's possible that Harrison is just not the right call, but I thought that it's a pretty low cost hedge in terms of just being a reasonable minion in
hmm,
the format where like because people are they have to play stuff like 5/5s, like they can't be
yeah,
playing the high health minions. They have to be playing generally, stuff that is largely on curve, or like for the stat progression
yeah.
because they have
It's
to be
it's it's
on.
either like like bad health or extreme health,
Right. I
right?
mean, like one of the downsides of Harrison Jones is it matches up poorly against cards like Piloted Shredder or cards like Druid of the Claw. It's like people can't play those.
Hmm.
So, a lot of the downsides of Harrison Jones, I think, are mitigated just by the rules of the format.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I am curious because we mentioned these small attack values. There's a lot of strategy surrounding them. That you only have one Shadow Word Pain, even though you're running two Shrinkmeisters.
Yeah, I thought about having another one, and this was sort of just going back and forth with some of my last card choices. Like I thought, I was like, well, maybe I should play two Shattered Pain. Maybe I want one in the Resurrect. It's possible I went a little bit too heavy on just the big minions in the deck. I have three 7 drops in my deck with which is kind of heavy. But I felt like in particular in the cases where you're going to end up with lots of decks are a little bit lower power level than you would get sort of typically in
Hmm.
normal constructed in Hearthstone. I think that having those individually powerful cards, especially when people are unlikely to have great tools to deal with them, is often going to be able to decide a lot of games. People aren't going to really have the same level of strong curves they'll have in natural games. Because they can't play the most efficient things at every drop. So I think that games are often going to go longer,
Yeah.
and that can often mean that having more of just the individually powerful cards can be what defines who wins the games.
Hmm. So you kind of feel this is more of a mid-game to control type of battle. Did
I
you consider making an aggressive deck?
I mean, I thought about it, but didn't really, like I basically spent my time building these 3 decks. Like I think that if I had gone, in sort of down the rabbit hole of some other classes or some other deck styles, I may have sort of just run out of time. I was
Hmm.
largely playing, like decks and classes that I'm pretty familiar with and, know the sort of stuff that I think is good and can sort of parse what the implications of the restrictions are. Or if I'm like, I think I have like less than 10 wins on Warlock or something like that. And I
Yeah.
was like, well, you can play Flame Imp and you can play Doomguard, so that's pretty attractive. But
Yeah.
like you lose, power overwhelming, you lose abusive sergeant or dark iron dwarf, and a lot of those what feel like they're
And the
pretty
eggs. Yeah.
right, exactly. A lot of the cards that feel pretty important for those sorts of strategies, and I felt more comfortable tinkering with decks for classes that I have just played a lot. Like all
Yeah.
3 of these classes are classes I have gold in ranked with. So like
And
okay,
I
I've
think that
done with a lot of these before.
that strategy really shows. I think you more than anything, you just have very refined, balanced decks, and I think this comes from like knowing not only what's good, but knowing like literally at the top of your head the cards that fit the parameters, which I think was your strength in this challenge, and I think that really shows. So I think you did a great job. I think your chances are quite good. How do you feel about that? Are you taking this tournament down?
I mean, I'm gonna do my best. I definitely have already had a lot of fun. So even just like I definitely really enjoy the challenge of thinking about games in different ways and sort
Hmm.
of trying to adapt to those sort of parameters. And I think that I'll see what different zoo decks that Zixo has when you play them in the first round at least, and hopefully my decks full of sludge belchers and shield masters and stuff are good enough there.
Well, we'll see.
We
Good
will.
job.
All right, so it's kind of cool. Kibler really knowing these classes, really knowing what cards actually kind of fit in, and I
Yeah.
really like the fact that he looked at things such as, oh, why don't I use 3 mana 3/4s because that's going to be really hard for everyone to trade into. Really good approach to his deck construction for sure.
His main theme was just going with what you know, and it's obviously worked out for him. All his decks are fairly well refined, even though it doesn't even have a warlock. Yeah, but
No.
warlocks seem more like the best classes. But he would say, I don't know warlock that well, so I guess we're
Mm,
not playing warlock. And yeah, it seems that the familiarity really comes through.
yeah,
He's seemed pretty confident about his decks, and well, it's realized he's in the final against Mr. Trump. Uh,
indeed.
let's get to his
Uh,
interview. Let's see how confident. Let's see what he had to say right after building his decks a few days back. So Trump, you made the decks, Mage, Druid, and Warlock. What'd you think of the challenge?
Yeah, it was pretty. I liked it. It definitely put a lock on the type of things, and you had to think on your feet. I actually roped at the end, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with what I did during the time given.
How did the rope affect you? Like what was the last minute decision?
Well, I mean, at the end, I didn't get to go back to the Warlock deck, which I started on. I
Hmm.
had put in a few filler cards and was like, okay, once I get through all of them, I'm going to go back to the Warlock and then change the deck a little bit, and I didn't get to it. And also, the rope made me forget to put Doctor Boom into the Mage deck.
Yeah, Dr. Boom's going to be a big one. So I'm sure you noticed very quickly, like Silences and Big Game Hunter are out, so some of the big creatures are going to stick. Um, what was the strategy? So you started with Warlock, I guess. Was that your first class?
So my general strategy was I spent like the first 5 or maybe even 10 minutes. I haven't went back to look yet, just looking at all my options. So that
Hmm.
may not have been the best strategy upon looking back at it. But yeah, the first screen that you start off when you open the collection screen just happens to be Druid, and then you stare at it and you're like, oh yeah, Innervate, that's an even spell. Wild Growth, that's an even spell. This
Yeah.
deck's easy. So. Uh, and then I thought about Warlock and had a bunch of stuff. And then I was like, oh man, you want to use odd attack minions. So that's going to be really good for the Hobgoblin deck. And then I started thinking about that.
No
No.
Hobgoblin. Yeah, unfortunately. Well, I actually think you have some very good decks. I was mentioning how, yeah, I tried to challenge myself, and I did make very similar decks to what you did. I'm very glad to see the Violet Teacher representing.
Yeah,
But
we actually, since we both went to Korea together with that deck like featuring prominently,
mhm.
um, makes sense that we would both think of that.
Yeah. Um, Now, what do you think will be strong? Now, my thoughts designing the challenge, I thought I'd make all the options possible. Like, I think you can play aggro. I think you can play mid-range. I think you can play zoo. I think you can play control. But what do you think would be like strongest? Because you have a little bit of a varying theme here. You have like an aggressive-ish warlock deck, an aggressive-ish mage, and a controlling druid.
Well, I did actually get to think about nearly all the options. What I approached it from was I've played a lot of decks over the last 2 months, a lot of different decks. So I got to think about which one of those decks fits best in this challenge. And it turns out that three of them actually fit particularly well, which are the three that I brought. So I didn't take it as much from an arena perspective of just putting in the good cards, but well, kind of that. But I also was just thinking about which decks tend to use even spells and just happen to have odd cards. And like Druid is a no-brainer. You have all the
Hmm.
ancients, you have the Innervate, you have the Wild's Growth, and then oh my gosh, I forgot your question.
That's okay. Um, Scarlet Crusader. That's the first time we're seeing that, but that's also one of the cards I put in a few of my decks. So I also agree it's a pretty nice card. But what is your reasoning for it? I also see you have the Squires. You find the Divine Shield strong in this format.
Yeah. Oh crap! I forgot to put in Blood Knight. Anyways, yeah, it was a good old zoo deck. So you put in the buffs, you put in the abusive. I mean, I have the advantage of having played since the beginning of the beta.
Yeah.
So I get to know like, okay, so these cards were in this deck beforehand. Like nowadays, you use the Confangled Imp Gang bus and
Yeah.
like other stuff, but when you've played like really, really long ago, you get to more quickly remember what cards were in the deck.
Yeah.
And those
Yeah.
cards were in the deck before, so they should be good.
Yeah. What do you think your chances are going through Strife Crow and maybe winning the thing?
I think I chose the three classes which are going to be strongest just based on the limitation of the challenge. I may not have built them perfectly. One thing that I just realized through talking to you is that Blood Knight would have been really good. One more thing is that Mind Control Tech would have been really good. I just remembered
Mhm.
your question also, and I expect this to be a really minion-based format because obviously a lot of the spells are out,
Yeah.
and a lot of the spells are what dictate what decks are good. So one of the things that I did when I started was just looked through all the classes, see like, okay, we can't play warrior because a lot of their key
Removal's
cards have been
gone, yeah.
removed. Shield Slam, Execute,
Hmm.
etc. There's no way I can play Shaman with all the 1 mana spells destroyed. So it was more of a process of elimination to arrive at the decks that I chose.
All right. Well, I think you came up with some good ones. Good luck.
Thank you.
All right, so a little bit different from
Stuff.
Trump. Yeah, he's kind of like just using the classes he thinks will be best, trying to figure out like which decks that he's been using lately kind of fit the format well.
When we saw him build the decks, and if you guys want to see the actual raw deck building part, we did watch all of that in fast forward yesterday. But it is a little bit of a long process, so we didn't want to play that for you guys again today. If you guys do want to check it out, make sure you check out the first day's broadcast. Trump, unlike every other player, spent I think like 7 minutes doing absolutely nothing, if I remember correctly. Just like going
Yeah.
through the cards, seeing which ones are good. And yeah, that does seem to be reflected in his card choices and in his class choices, of course.
Yeah.
So good
So,
stuff.
yeah, it's kind of cool. Two different approaches from these two, but definitely like very aimed approaches unlike the other 6 players.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm excited to see now because the rules are a little bit different, as you were mentioning before.
Hmm.
This is going to be a best of 7 with a revival, and every deck you can change 2 cards in.
Yep.
So, I think
And
it's about time to look at that.
well, let's have a look. I also want to mention that these players have never faced against each other. The only information they have is the class choices of each other.
Hmm.
So what do we have here? Yeah, Kibler's bringing the Priest Pally Druid, and he knows he's up against the Warlock Mage Druid of Trump.
That's right.
So we can see that
Yeah,
Harrison
his
Jones,
changes. Probably
Harrison
not good against
Jones,
those 3 classes, right?
yeah, yeah. The only weapon against Trump's arsenal is possibly against a Jiraxis weapon.
Yeah.
So he's
So
decided to remove Harrison on every single deck.
makes a lot of sense, and that's like very easily done for him. Other than that, in the
Yeah.
priest deck, he actually removed that resurrect and added in
Hmm.
the second Shadow Word Pain. So that was kind of what we were talking about. Like if he had a
Yeah.
mistake in these decks, that was it.
Hmm.
So that's very nice.
And for
Uh,
the Harrison, he drops in the Light Bomb, so more of a big clear. It seemed like the Priest, but when it was winning, it was just winning. You could afford to tank a few cards in your hand. But when it was losing, it was hard to come back in the game. So I think Light Bomb really improves that situation. I think his choices were extremely appropriate, given his history throughout the games.
yeah, it
Now,
seems like really solid changes. I think that really
mhm.
brings up the power of the priest deck overall.
What else did he take on the Druid? Let's have a look. He took out 1 Haunted Creeper in
Hmm.
addition to the Harrison Jones, and he dropped in a second Mark of the Wild, and now with 2 Mark of the Wilds, he put in Echoing Ooze.
Sick, sick.
You ready? Combo time.
Yeah, man. It's pretty cool. I think that this it kind of like strengthens his early game a little bit, I guess, and makes him.
Mm.
I mean, the possibility of Mark of the Wild Echoing Ooze against something like Trump's Zoo deck. Of course, he doesn't know if it's Zoo or Demon Lock or what it
He
is, but
probably has a good idea, but yeah.
yeah, Trump is very well known for playing Zoo very well, so I would probably assume that it was Zoo. It's nice. He's kind of shoring that deck up a
Yeah.
little bit.
Now that we're seeing the decks again, I mean, we just saw Trump play the Vile Teacher Druid, and Kibler's also got a Vile Teacher Druid. The deck list is almost exact. The main difference is that Mark of the Wild, but with the format, with creatures only being able to be played with odd attack values, taking out the silences and the Black Knight, and of course the big game, which is somewhat less relevant, the Mark of the Wild suddenly becomes a pretty damn good card, especially when you have Vile Teacher for 1 to protect those 1/1s, but also now you're Echoing Ooze. How about that?
That's right. Yeah.
But let's think back. Are like even though every single player played Druid for this format, were there any other players that used the Violet Teacher combo? Do you remember any?
Um, I can't think of seeing many Violet teachers so far.
Yeah.
Like these two played it. I remember specifically that Life Coach was like hitting himself in the head over forgetting it.
Yeah.
And Savitz, let's not talk about that deck. Um,
He did have Echoing Ooze, I believe.
yeah,
Forcefully.
he certainly did have that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you might be right. These might be the two that really realized the power of the
Mhm.
Violet Teacher in this deck, which definitely like that's even something you mentioned. That was one of the first decks that you built, and it certainly seems to be like the deck to make. Really,
Yeah.
really like the choice.
Yeah. Well, he made a few changes in the
Oh,
Paladin as well. He took out the Harrison, and apparently, I don't even remember this, but apparently he had one of Acidic Swamp
oh
Ooze
yeah, okay.
really going overboard against the weapons.
Mm.
And instead, I think he realized the mistake. I think we talked about this a little bit early on, how the Paladin players didn't actually put in Wild Pyromancer. But there it is, double Wild Pyro, and suddenly Equality is much stronger of a card. We saw it tank a few games. We saw Kibler. Uh, was it Kibler? No. Trump played Life Coach.
Life Coach, yeah, he was the one that
How Life
he had
Coach
like
was just
two
tanking the
equalities.
equalities, yeah.
Yeah.
And now with a lot more activators, it's really good. It's really important to do this. Like some people forget about this type of Paladin deck. With the new Paladin cards, it's just like harder to fit everything in, so you don't see the Pyromancers anymore. But equality really only combos with Consecrate or having like a Muster already. With Muster gone, like Consecrate is good by itself. Pyromancer is good by itself, but Equality needs like more than just Consecrate to combo. So I think Wild Pyro is absolutely the correct choice. I think if Kilber didn't nail it already with his original 3 decks, he absolutely like on spot with the substitutions.
Yeah, these decks look sick.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at Trump's decks because these three look amazing. His changes were
hmm
all spot on. I guess it was a little bit obvious to take out the weapon kill, so that was
Yeah.
like very easy for him to switch. Let's see what Trump switched though.
But the stuff he put in was also very good. And I do want to mention
Yeah.
that even though his decks are really strong, just because he doesn't have a Warlock and because Trump's set of decks is so good already, maybe the failure to go with Warlock might actually cost them because it
They
is one of the
could.
most dominant classes.
Yeah. Well, taking a look at what Trump has changed here, let's start with his Warlock deck. He
Yeah.
took out both of the Elven Archers and added a Sylvanas and a Blood Knight.
hmm
Yeah, I mean, against the classes his opponent is playing, do you really need those Elven Archers? Like, it doesn't seem like the most powerful card.
Yeah, these seem pretty worthless. They were basically like support for the juggler.
Mm.
That's really about it. I think the Elven Archers were like a guess that people would play like a wider range of decks, but most people are playing like kind of heavier mid-range into control. And Elven Archer is really poor against those. And he's got enough 1-drops already. Like 6 1-drops is fine. You're not playing like face zoo and then overwhelm your opponent like crazy. You're playing like fair zoo. You just need a 1-drop. You don't need 2 1-drops on turn 2. You don't need 3 1-drops on turn 3, right?
Hmm.
You're playing kind of the curve out type of deck, and I think 6 1-drops is perfectly fair for that. So again, I do have to agree. Sylvanas a little bit more of a I think more of an experimental substitution, but still
Yeah,
still very strong.
could be
Just probably
helpful,
just felt yeah, I mean the deck was winning, and when it started like getting board cleared, his cards just weren't powerful enough. So I think
Hmm.
Sylvanas makes up for that. I think Blood Knight might make it so he might get a free win here and there. So
Hmm.
why not?
Yeah, you actually mentioned, I believe, in the interview, something like, "Oh yeah, Blood Knight. Oh God, like why didn't I play that?" I think we only saw like one player actually use Blood Knight in that
I
run of
think
it as
Sixo
well.
had 2 in one of his decks,
I think you're right. Yeah.
but none of them hit, unfortunately.
No, no. Well, I guess let's look at that middle mage deck next. Looks like he took out an Argent Squire and a Hungry Dragon. Put in that Doctor Boom that he just completely forgot to do at the end of the
Yeah,
deck building, that's an obvious one. You got to put him in,
yeah, it is an
and then
obvious one.
added Sylvanas as well.
hmm well, we've seen this mage play out 0 games, so
Yeah.
yeah, okay. Like I forgot there was a Hunger Dragon in there at all. Uh, but yeah, seems like a good deck. It's kind of like a tempo mage. It has those Violent Teachers to sustain and push for a little bit more damage. I think very good choices overall. And I think the Sylvanas and Doctor Boom, again, kind of tech up. You realize it's really hard to rush these opponents down.
Mhm.
But when you play these like tempo-y mid-rangey decks, like we kind of talked about in the Druid Mirror, you only need like a few late game cards. Like when you hit the late game, you just want to keep up for a turn or two, and then you win anyway. So you
Mhm.
don't need to like flood your deck with big cards, but having just a few like he just substituted in, I think does make the deck a lot stronger.
Sure. I'm looking at the last deck here, the Druid deck. Looks like he's taken out Argent Squire and the Harrison Jones, and
Harrison.
he's, yeah, the weapon kill just not really needed. Only Paladin really having weapons. And he puts in a Mind Control tech and a Blood Mage Thalamus. What do you think about that?
Well, looks like quite inspired from Life Coach. I mean, you saw the Thalnos played by Life Coach. Like, yeah, that seems pretty good. I mean, I got rats, I got swipes. I could use a redraw. I could use just a small minion to buff up with Power of the Wild. It's actually stronger in Trump's decks than it was in Life Coach, and it was good enough in Life Coach already. And with the MC tech, well, do we really need to talk about that? I mean, Battle Cry 14/14, not bad.
Yeah, it's pretty good for 3 mana. So yeah, really good sets of decks from both guys. Whose decks do you prefer? Who do you think is going to actually take this down?
We really haven't seen mage decks be too successful. So far, the mages that have been played were not this mage, though. So the mage is kind of a wild card for me. I just don't really know what to expect. It seems like if you draw really, really well, you're going to tempo out your opponent. But if you don't, I don't know.
Yeah. I have to say, I think this is going to go to Kibler. I'm kind of feeling it. I really like his set of decks. I agree with you on the mage thing. I'm not sure how well this is going to go against these other decks. I like imagine a flame cannon like hitting a Violet Teacher token and just like, oh, I don't know. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm feeling Kibler a little bit over Trump here.
Yeah, I think Kibler has a slightly better Druid deck. I think Mage versus Paladin, I think it's really close. I think the Mage generally wins, but with the added Pyromancer, you can really take that tempo back.
Yeah.
And I think the Priest counters the Warlock. I don't know, man. It seems like Kibler might have a marginal edge, but
yeah, I think he has a
really
marginal
tough
edge.
to call. It's really tough to call.
Yeah. Well, I think we're about ready to get into it, man. This is going to be a best of 7, guys. So let's go ahead, jump into game number 1, see what these guys want to open up with.
I think the opener is really the biggest deal here.
Yeah.
Is it
agreed
Warlock
on
versus
that.
Priest again?
Ooh.